Is Romans 14 introduces a brand new subject, although there is a sense in which it still goes back to what we studied in chapter 12, love is without hypocrisy. Ultimately, this chapter will manifest itself as a matter of walking in love with respect to our brothers and sisters in Christ. And so we'll just start in verse 1 and looking at question number 1, which comes from verse 1. Some very great words to study here. Receive one who is weak in the faith, but not to disputes over doubtful things. Now, when I started working on this material, I knew just from the very outset that there were some very important words that needed to be discussed, because this verse sets the tone for everything, or the first two verses really set the tone for everything all the way through chapter 15, verse 7. Okay, and so some of the words in particular are very important for us to study, because we're going to build on those particular themes and ideas as we make our way through the text. The word receive there means to take to or take with one's self in one's company, to admit into one's society and fellowship, to receive and treat with kindness. The word is also found in verse 3. And again, I told you, all the way through Romans 15, verse 7, found twice in that that's a verse that really concludes this entire thought. 14:1 to 15:7. So it's found in verse 1, it's found in verse 3, it's found twice in 15:7. The idea here is to make as one, or to make equal without distinction. To make equal without distinction. And it's also used of eating or taking food. In other words, to receive food means to eat food. Okay, and once you eat food, it becomes part of you, right? You and the food are essentially one and the same. And so this is the concept that is there. Then the word disputes over doubtful things. And the word disputes means to evaluate for potential condemnation another's thoughts which underlie his conduct. In other words, we're looking at somebody and what they do, and we're really, it's the idea of an intent to impugn somebody's motives. Now, assuming the worst in why a person does what they do. Okay, and so we're not allowed to do that. It means to pronounce judgment on another's opinions or scruples, a thing that belongs solely within divine discretion. Now, I have intended to use the word scruple pretty regularly through this text, but and I probably even stated it here in these notes, and then I got away from it because I used the word conscience, because I think conscience is a more well-known, well-worn word. And I did not, and you'll see it, I did not want to use the word opinion, even though some of the texts will say, some of the translations might use the word opinion. But disputes mean to pronounce judgment on another's opinions or scruples, a thing that belongs within divine discretion. The definition of scruple is the feeling of doubt or hesitation concerning the morality of a course of action. In other words, here's something that is under consideration, and I'm not certain as to whether or not this course of action is right or wrong. And usually when we start talking about scruple, we usually think of it. It's usually used in the idea of the person thinks it's wrong. The person thinks it's wrong. It doesn't mean that it is necessarily wrong. But if he thinks it is, right, and that argument is going to be all the way down to verse 13. But we think about scruple, it means when a person hesitates to pursue an action because they wonder about the moral nature of that thing. Okay? The thing is not wrong in and of itself, but one's thinking or attitude toward the thing causes him concern as to whether or not he can or should participate. I said we will use the term scruple or conscience throughout this study, as opinion is not nearly as strong a term as presently used in our everyday conversations. Opinions and matters of conscience are not that closely related. Also, opinions about many things abound outside the realm of what is called moral oughtness. You know, human beings have an inherent sense of moral oughtness. Now, we know that there are some things that we should do, and we know that there are some things that we should not do, that you really don't even have to be taught that those things. And if I'm not mistaken, in philosophy, that is known as ontology, the ontological argument, that man has to be made by a higher being because man has a moral oughtness, that does not exist anywhere else in the realm of living things. Okay, so you can have opinions about football teams or Ford and Chevrolet or whatever. Opinions abound across the board. They don't have anything to do with conscience or matters of scruple. Then the word doubtful things. Doubtful. Look at the word there. Dialogismos. And you can easily see the word dialogue in this word. Okay, the root meaning dia, which is through, logos, which is word, implying that dialogue is a discussion between two individuals or groups who are not in agreement. In this case, the discussion concerns matters between brethren, which are not matters of faith and fellowship, but rather belong in the realm of conscience. Because that's another thing I want to emphasize. What we talk about in Romans 14 and 15 are not matters of sin. They're not matters of fellowship. They're matters of dialogue, matters of conscience, not wrong in and of themselves. And by the way, a lot of times we use the word dialogue in a far more general idea that it's just two people talking. But in the formal sense, a dialogue is two people who don't agree, who are having a discussion, trying to reach either agreement or understanding. In other words, I'll just give you an example. Been a year, it's been longer than that, probably been 5 years now. Over 5 years, because it was during the pandemic. 5 years to get away from your heartbeat. I was having a discussion with a brother who was a part of the non-institutional group. He was in another state, and we were talking about what's called the sponsoring church concept and whatnot. Can churches pool their resources and send money to a missionary through a single congregation rather than each congregation sending their own check to the individual? And we were talking about it. Of course, many of our non-institutional brethren think that it's a sin, for 5 or 6 churches to send all their money to one congregation, and that one congregation send, a singular check to a missionary, so to speak. And so we were having a dialogue about this. Now look, when we got done with our discussion, here's what he said. He said, I see what you're saying now. And what it boiled down to was, it wasn't what he was told was happening. I had hours of conversations with Jeremiah's mom about this in 1999. And here's what she kept saying. After she would ask me questions and I would answer, and she would say, that's not what we were told. That's not what we were told this was. And when I could show on paper, how things were actually being done, she how would I say? She agreed that this was a good way to do things and had no objection. My friend in another state said, I still don't know that that's the best way to do it, but I see what you're saying now, and I don't think it's wrong. So what did we have? We had a dialogue. In one case, we came to an agreement. In another case, we came to an understanding and both walked away from that conversation believing that both of us were brethren, faithful to the Lord, just choosing to do the same thing in a different way. That's what dialogue is all about. And we need more dialogue. We need more dialogue in so many aspects, in the brotherhood, in society, in politics. We need more dialogue. We need more attempts to gain agreement or at least understanding. That is this word. All right? Last note. This truth is summarized in the last verse of the chapter. But he who doubts is condemned if he eats, because he does not eat from faith. For whatever is not of faith is sin. And this entire chapter and much of 15 deals with the matters of scruple and conscience and not actions that are inherently sinful. Now, I want to make clear about a couple things. In the opening line, receive one who is weak in the faith. It doesn't mean that the person's faith is weak. It means their understanding of the faith is weak. They might have the strongest faith in the world, but there are things about the faith, that they don't understand. You see, there's the matter of faith, which we have, and the faith, which is what we believe. So he's weak in the faith. There are things about the faith that he doesn't understand. But his faith itself is very strong because it's compelling him to do or not to do a certain thing. Okay? So we're not talking about people who have weak faith. We're talking about people who have a less than proper or full understanding of what the faith allows. And I think that's a very important distinction to make. They have a limited understanding. That's exactly right. By the way, in Acts chapter 10, Peter was weak in the faith. The Lord dropped that sheet down and said, "Arise, Peter, kill and eat." And he says, "Not so, Lord. I've never eaten anything common or unclean." And the Lord said, "What God has cleansed, you don't call unclean." And the Bible says that happened 3 times. And the sheet was carried up. And then God revealed it to him through the Holy Spirit and the arrival of the group of men from the household of Cornelius. Peter had strong faith. But in this area, he was weak in the faith because he didn't have a proper understanding about what he could eat and what he couldn't eat. And by the way, Jesus had already cleansed those foods all the way back in Mark chapter 7. And then when the New Testament came, the New Covenant came into authority or into validity, so to speak, all food was clean from the day of Pentecost forward. All food was clean. And Acts 10 is years down the road from Acts 2. So Peter was weak in the faith in that respect, but nobody would accuse Peter of having weak faith. Right? All right, so I want to make sure that we have a proper understanding when we start talking about strong in the faith, weak in the faith, and what that means. Now the word "for," here's the explanation. Verse 2. For one believes he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats only vegetables. One who is strong in the faith believes he can eat all things, but the one who is weak eats only vegetables. Sure.
This year I've lost 22 pounds. I've been trying to make it a point. Everything I put in my mouth to pray for God to put it, to use in my body. Almost everything. If I eat say a strawberry and thank Him for it. And I lost 22 pounds this year.
Yeah. Well, the Bible says everything is sanctified by the Word of God and prayer. 1 Peter 4, verse 5. And so...
But I feel guilty when I forget.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. When you get in the habit of doing good, when you don't do good, it makes you feel bad when you don't do it.
Yeah.
All right, number 2. First note, this is the first of several examples of what might fall in the matter of conscience. Consider also that the differing views are not considered as equal. This had never occurred to me until I started studying this. The view of the strong and the view of the weak is not equal. Because if it was equal, one of them wouldn't be considered strong and the other view wouldn't be considered weak. You see? And that, by the way, there's a lesson for us there. Sometimes Christians have the idea that if anybody's offended by it, we can't do it. If anybody is opposed to it, we can't do it. If anybody objects to it, we can't do it. The Bible doesn't teach that. Because if that were the case, every single person in the church would be the ruler of the church in whatever matter it is that they object to. Right? In one sense, Vince objects. The other 89 people say yes. Vince says no, so we got to capitulate to Vince. Now, if Vince can show us in the Bible where it's wrong, that's a different matter. But if he's just against it, we don't have to capitulate to Vince. But then in the next matter, Kath is upset. And we have to capitulate to Katha. In this, you see how everything would be subject to one person's objection. Right? So, what I'm saying is that not everybody's objections are equal. Not everybody's understanding. You couldn't do anything. You couldn't do anything if you had to have absolute anonymity on absolutely every single thing. Oh man, can you imagine? Can you imagine? All right, so they're not equal. As it is the weak Christian who does not eat meat, eating only vegetables. Again, the word strong does not appear in the context until Romans 15:1, but we infer it from the distinctions made in the actions of some verses, those expressly defined as weak. In other words, if here's position A that is espoused, and there's no adjective attached to it, but it's contrasted with position B, and position B is called weak, then by inference we know position A is strong. Okay? And I'm just making mention of that because we're going to talk about strong and weak through this whole thing, and we have to understand that in most cases the strong has to be inferred because it's contrasted with the weak. All right? The distinction between strong and weak faith will manifest itself throughout this chapter all the way through verse 7 of chapter 15. And then I already got ahead of myself. This is not a discussion as to the level or amount of one's faith, but to what each Christian's faith permitted them to do in the realm of conscience. Now, another point of interest, and I was clear to say, at least to me, you may not be interested in it in the least, but here's what I thought was interesting, is the silence as to which group of Christians were the weak ones. Because Rome was made up of Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians. In other words, it was a blended church. And when you blend two groups of people, there's going to be different ideas about how things ought to be done, right? I mean, and it's not that one is right and the other is wrong. They're just different. I mean, think for a minute. Just think, I wish, and I know it's disappearing in a lot of places, but I wish I wish towns wouldn't have a black church and a white church. But a lot of them do. There's a black church and a white church. And by the way, I think it'd be good if there was just one congregation and everybody was in it, okay? But when you blend a black church and a white church, you're bringing really two different cultures together, right? Now look, those things are not unovercomable, if I might coin the term. Look, if Jews and Gentiles could blend together and make a church, black folks and white folks can blend together and make a church. And it might be that both sides would need to give some, on some things, or maybe areas of compromise. But I don't like the black church, white church concept. I'm not a fan. All right. So the Bible here doesn't tell us which one is strong or which one is weak. And this is Brother David Roper, who wrote one of the two different Romans commentaries on the Truth for Today series. Says, Brother David Roper postulated that the weaker Christians could be the Gentiles who were extremely conscious of the idolatrous lives they'd left behind. Thus, they were inclined to forego eating meat so as to completely separate themselves from their former idolatry. In other words, just to make sure I don't eat anything that has anything to do with an idol, I'm not going to eat any meat. So in other words, their conscience says, I want to get as far away from idolatry as I possibly can. I don't even want to accidentally eat meat offered to an idol. Okay? On the other hand, the weaker Christian could have been the Jewish Christian who is concerned with eating meat either offered to idols or concerned with eating non-kosher meat. Your Gentile Christian, is serving up catfish, and pulled pork. By the way, I'm down with that. But if you were a Jew, you wouldn't be down with that. If you didn't have a proper understanding of what you could eat. And it might be the case that you knew you could eat it, but you don't because you can't eat it in a good conscience. Now I want you to think about I want you to file that away, because that's something that's really been working in my mind. I spent a lot of time talking to Bill about this. There's the strong in the faith, whose faith allows him to do whatever. There's the weak in the faith, whose conscience does not allow him to do whatever. But you can be weak in the faith and still be strong by doing what Paul says. In other words, here's Bobby. Bobby's strong in the faith. Bobby's got that catfish and pulled pork out there. All right? I'm weak in the faith. I've been a Jew all my life. My Jewish roots go back. I can trace them back. I can't eat it in good conscience. Right? But I can recognize that Bobby has the right to eat it, and wish him well in so doing. So there's a sense in which I'm still the weak Christian, aren't I? I'm still the weak Christian because my conscience doesn't permit me to do what Bobby's doing, but I'm strong enough to accept Paul's teaching to let Bobby do what he's doing without condemning him, even though I couldn't do it. So you see, there's really kind of there's a third category there, isn't there? And really, when we get down toward the end, there's really a fourth category. But there's that third category, which is the weak Christian who recognizes the liberties of the strong and is not offended by those things.
I've been trying to get Kathy to eat shrimp.
Won't eat shrimp. Man. So I'm going to assume that crawdads are out of the picture then, right? Out of the question. What? I don't know if she's weak or if she's strong.
Well, I can't say that about it.
But just because it's Kathy, I'm going to say weak. All right. Second paragraph, top of page 2. This in and of itself may be the most important lesson of all. The identity of the weaker brother is of no consequence. It really doesn't matter who the weaker brother is in this thing. In fact, it may well be that the weaker brother thinks he's the stronger brother. The weak brother can think he's the strong brother, when in fact he's not. And here's what I was telling you about. I had so many things I wanted to share with you, and I wanted to put this on paper rather than just tell it to you. Okay? Billy and I had this very conversation with Toby in Ghana 20 years ago. And by the way, it was so funny. Bill brought this up in a conversation brought this conversation up in one of our conversations last week. That's the kind of impression that this has had on us, because he and I have really been studying Romans 14 a lot. All right? We both realized in this past week that at the time we thought we were among the stronger Christians in a matter, when in fact now we both realized we were wrong. And since I know you're all wondering what that matter concerned, it was the matter of having coffee and donuts in Bible class. Billy and I were opposed to the practice. Toby wasn't in favor of it either. But he wasn't as adamant as we were, and he questioned whether or not the three of us were actually the strong brethren in the matter. In other words, Toby could see, look, when we had this conversation, and by the way, Billy and I talked about this again today, there is no way you would have ever convinced me and Bill 20 years ago that we were the weak brethren in that matter. We were the strong brethren, right? Because we're upholding the faith. We're upholding the soundness of the faith. You would have never convinced us that we were the weak brethren in that matter. And now we realize we were the weak brethren in that matter. Now let me just go on and say a couple more things. Billy and I thought it was wrong to have coffee and donuts in Bible class.
Why did you think you were the weak, or why did you change your mind if you were weak or strong? I'm confused.
All right, Billy and I thought that having coffee and donuts in Bible class was wrong. Okay? So we thought those who wanted to bring coffee and donuts in Bible class were liberal, which made them weak. Okay? Now we understand. Coffee and donuts in Bible class is a matter of scruple. It's a matter of scruple. It's a matter of conscience. It's not a matter of the faith like we thought it was 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, we thought we were the strong brethren, and now we realize, in fact, we were the weak brethren because our conscience wouldn't allow us to do what other brethren's conscience allowed them to do in a matter that didn't have anything to do with doctrine or fellowship.
Do you think that was because tradition?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I can remember being at O'Fallon.
Never. Like the first time I saw that happen, I'm like, oh my God.
You like to choke, didn't you? And by the way, I'm not in favor of it now. I'm not in favor of it now.
Churches do it.
They do, but that's my point. That's my point. I had been so ingrained in the way I would.
As a kid, church, we had this family moved in from Michigan, and the lady had the audacity to wear pants to church.
No, she did not wear pants to church.
On Wednesday night.
On Wednesday night?
On Wednesday night.
Heresy.
And there was, it was like a 6-month, year-long, whispering.
A whisper campaign.
And of course now we've got,
Yeah.
everybody was.
Yeah.
And of course,
Yeah, the skirts got so short. I wish they'd wear pants. But all right, but that's exactly what we're talking about, right? Everybody that was dress only thought they were the stronger brethren.
My dad never let us wear pants, ever. I don't care if it's
All right, but the point is, would he consider himself the strong brother or the weak brother? Then the strong.
He still would consider himself a strong.
And yet he doesn't have enough sense to know that he's weak.
Yeah, I had a guy tell me if it don't bother you, you can do it.
Well, that's only true up to a point, but that's the point we're getting at.
Yeah, I know. But
I remember the first time I saw somebody toting a donut and a cup of coffee in the Bible class, and man, it bothered me. And the thing is, I worked for the church where I witnessed it. And I'm like, man, I don't even know if I can work here anymore. I mean, this place is out there.
But, the way I look at doctrine, there's no give.
No giving doctrine. No giving doctrine.
If it's not doctrine, give me liberty.
Yeah, but you can barely spell doctrine without donut. But you see,
But why was it wrong?
because we never did. Nobody ever did that way, Judy.
Well,
Nobody dare bring their breakfast into Bible
but now,
class.
you have to realize, though, too, a lot of things change in church because it changes in culture.
That's right.
My mother went to school in St. Louis, public schools, and you had to wear a dress to school. So if you got to wear a dress to school, for sure you're going to wear a dress to church.
I get it.
I mean, that would make sense. You wouldn't dress down to go to
But
church.
again, the point is, I thought that the donut eaters were the weak brethren, and they thought the pants wearers were the weak brethren, and all of us were wrong.
Well, I've never seen that or tried it, but won't you bring down that?
Angie, you weren't listening. I said I'm against it. And so if I were to bring it, it would violate my conscience. Are you asking me to violate my conscience? Well, it sounds like you're asking me to violate my conscience. Do whatever you want to do. But my point is that a lot of strong brethren, so-called, are actually weak brethren. And I was one, and in that matter, I was one of them. I was one of them. All right? And so, but again, you think about that conversation was over 20 years ago, and it still is etched in my mind of all the conversations I had with Bill and Toby over the course of 20 years and 14 trips to Africa. That one's still ingrained in all of our minds, that we thought we were the strong brethren, and Toby had the audacity to suggest that we weren't. So,
If somebody comes in dressed inappropriate, it bothers you? I mean,
if they're dressed inappropriately,
Immodest or
immodest, not modest.
that would
all right, it would only bother me if I knew the person knew better. If it was somebody off the street,
No.
I wouldn't bat an eye.
Okay,
I wouldn't bat an eye.
that's good.
Because people don't know what they don't know.
That's good.
And so, but people that ought to know better,
Oh, yeah.
But there's a lot of
Yeah.
people that
Yeah.
knows better. And
Oh, yes. Yeah, people.
and that can be dealt with. That can be dealt with. But you don't deal with non-Christians off the street the same way you deal with Christians that Those two animals are completely different people. And so, yeah, I would never judge anybody or deem it inappropriate. Somebody just walk. Listen, all right. Let me give you an example of this. And we'll stop and start number 3, Lord willing, next week. I was in a tent meeting in Jonesboro, Tennessee. Okay, big tent meeting. Right on the main highway. It's a retirement area. There's lakes, there's rivers and whatnot. We're having this tent meeting. It's first night. It's Sunday night. The tent's about half packed out. Somebody pulls in off the highway. Dude walks in, towel over, wearing I don't remember if he had a towel over around his neck or if he was wearing a wife beater, flip-flops and a swimsuit, and the girl walked in wearing a swimsuit, 2-piece, and walked in and sat down and attended that Sunday night service. And nobody treated them ill or like they didn't belong. We welcomed them. We talked to them. They came 2 more nights. And by the way, he said, obviously you didn't plan to make this stop, And they said, well, we're just on our way home from the lake, and or the river, and we'd never seen a tent meeting before, so we thought we'd stop in. Like, glad you did. Bikini and all.
They didn't wear their swimsuits the next night.
They did not wear their swimsuits the next 2 nights. That's exactly right. But not because we asked them not to. All right, but that's a perfect example of what you're talking about. All right, question number 3, next week, verse 3.